Among the nobility, hatred often outlived the people who first gave it life. Estates changed hands, titles passed from father to son, and generations forgot how old feuds had begun. Yet pride remembered. Pride never loosened its grip. It turned neighbors into enemies, celebrations into battlegrounds, and innocent hearts into bargaining pieces. Sometimes the greatest act of courage was not winning a war, but refusing to inherit one. A cold November wind swept across the rolling hills of Westmoreland, rattling the bare branches that lined the long drive to Blackthorn Manor. Clouds hung low over the countryside, casting the vast stone estate beneath a blanket of grey. The manor itself stood as though carved from a hillside, its ivy-covered walls weathered by generations of storms, its tall windows reflecting a sky that promised snow before nightfall. Inside, servants hurried through polished corridors preparing for the Earl of Ashcombe's annual winter gathering. Fires crackled in every drawing room. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished floors. Coaches carrying neighboring landowners arrived one after another, each visitor eager to secure favor with the Earl whose judgment had become almost as respected as his title. Yet despite the warmth within, the manor gates remained open to the bitter wind. Near the entrance stood 2 footmen watching the road with growing unease. A lone figure waited beyond the iron gates where the gravel met the public road. She carried no trunk, no servant, and no carriage remained in sight. Her travelling cloak, once finely made, had gathered dust from many miles, while the hem of her gown bore the marks of rain and mud. Has she been there long? One footman whispered. Since before sunrise. And no one has spoken to her. The steward instructed us not to. The younger servant frowned. Why? The older man lowered his voice. They say she bears the surname Hawthorne. At once the younger man's expression hardened. The Hawthorns? The Earl's enemies. So I've heard. Neither servant moved another step. Inside the manor, guests laughed over steaming tea and warm fires, unaware that someone stood alone in the freezing wind only yards away. The woman herself neither pleaded nor demanded entry. She simply waited. Every so often she lifted her eyes toward the towering house, not with expectation, but with quiet resolve, as though leaving would cost her far more than remaining in the cold. Snowflakes began drifting lazily from the darkening sky. They settled upon her shoulders without being brushed away. A stable boy carrying firewood slowed beside the gates. Miss, he said timidly, they won't open them. She offered him a gentle smile. I know. Then, why stay? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her composed face. Because sometimes the only place left to go is the one place you're least welcome. The boy had no answer. He hurried back toward the warmth of the estate, glancing over his shoulder as the lonely figure remained motionless against the falling snow. At that very moment, another carriage emerged from the distant woods and rolled steadily toward Blackthorn Manor. It bore no family crest upon its doors. Only the driver knew the man seated quietly inside. By sunset, the stranger waiting beyond the gates and the master of the manor would finally meet, and one decision would threaten to end a feud that had poisoned 2 families for nearly 30 years. The Hawthorne family had once been spoken of with admiration throughout Westmoreland. They had owned fertile lands, commanded respect in Parliament, and filled their halls with music rather than quarrels. Then came a bitter dispute over inheritance, a failed business partnership, and accusations neither family ever forgot. By the time Eleanor Hawthorne was born, children of the 2 houses had learned the other surname long before they learned forgiveness. Eleanor had never understood why she was expected to hate people she had never met. At 22, she possessed none of the dazzling beauty society celebrated so loudly. Her chestnut hair escaped its careful pins whenever the wind grew playful, and her soft grey-blue eyes carried the quiet habit of observing before speaking. Those who dismissed her as timid rarely noticed how much she understood about the hearts of others. She preferred libraries to ballrooms, gardens to gossip, listening to boasting. In her father's house, those qualities were often mistaken for weakness. Her elder brother, Edmund Hawthorne, believed gentleness invited defeat. Ever since inheriting the family estate, he had devoted himself to reviving the Hawthorne name. Unfortunately, restoring honor mattered less to him than defeating Ashcombe Manor. Never forget, he often declared across the dinner table, an Ashcombe smile hides a sharper blade than any soldier's sword. Eleanor never argued. She simply lowered her eyes and continued pouring tea. Only their aging housekeeper, Mrs. Whitby, knew the truth. One rainy afternoon months earlier, she had found Eleanor secretly delivering blankets and bread to tenant families after Edmund refused to reduce their rent following a poor harvest. You'll empty your own purse before winter ends, Mrs. Whitby had warned gently. Eleanor had smiled. What good is a full purse if everyone around it is hungry? That single sentence had remained with the old woman ever since. Kindness seemed to follow Eleanor as naturally as breathing. Yet kindness had earned her little happiness. 3 weeks before arriving at Blackthorn Manor, tragedy struck Hawthorne House. Their father died unexpectedly after a brief illness, leaving Edmund as head of the family. Grief hardened him further. Blaming every misfortune upon old enemies became easier than accepting fate. Then creditors arrived. Letters bearing crimson seals appeared almost daily. Servants quietly disappeared one after another as wages went unpaid. Furniture vanished from drawing rooms. Portraits were sold. Even the silver tea service that Eleanor's mother had treasured since her wedding disappeared into an auction cart before dawn. Still Edmund refused every reasonable solution. There is one man in England I shall never ask for help, he declared. The Earl of Ashcombe. Days later he rode away to London in search of investors, leaving only a short letter behind. If he did not return within a fortnight, Eleanor was to seek temporary shelter with distant relatives in York. She never reached York. Halfway through her journey, another messenger intercepted her carriage carrying devastating news. Edmund had been arrested over unpaid debts after a disastrous business agreement collapsed. Everything belonging to the Hawthorne estate would soon be seized. There remained only one person with enough influence to stop complete ruin. The very man her family had hated for nearly 3 decades. The Earl of Ashcombe. Most would have turned away rather than face such humiliation. Eleanor chose differently. She sold the last piece of jewelry her mother had left her to pay for the journey to Blackthorn Manor, determined not to beg for wealth, but to plead for fairness. If the Earl refused, her family name would disappear forever. As evening settled over the snow-covered countryside, Eleanor pulled her threadbare cloak tighter around her shoulders and looked once more toward the towering manor. Warm lights glowed from every window. Inside, music had begun. Outside, she waited alone, completely unaware that the Earl himself had not yet arrived. By the time Julian Ashcombe inherited his title, he He had already buried more dreams than most men buried friends. The 8th Earl of Ashcombe had never expected to rule one of the wealthiest estates in northern England. As the younger son, his childhood had been spent preparing for a military commission rather than a seat in the House of Lords. Discipline became second nature. Silence became his refuge. While other young noblemen pursued lavish entertainments in London, Julian learned to endure sleepless nights, harsh winters, and the heavy responsibility of commanding men whose lives depended upon his judgment. Everything changed 7 years earlier. His elder brother, Arthur, died after a riding accident on an icy bridge. Within a single week, Julian exchanged a captain's uniform for an earl's coronet. He never truly forgave fate for the exchange. Blackthorn Manor became his battlefield instead. The estate stretched across thousands of acres, supporting hundreds of tenant families whose livelihoods rested upon its careful management. Julian rose before sunrise every morning, often inspecting fields alongside Laboris before breakfast. He knew the names of shepherds, gardeners, blacksmiths, and stable boys more readily than those of fashionable ladies introduced during London's social season. His grandmother frequently scolded him. An earl must think of heirs, Julian. I think of harvests first. You cannot pass wheat fields to the next generation without a son. He always answered with the same faint smile. Then perhaps the wheat shall outlive me. The Dowager Countess sighed each time, convinced her grandson possessed every admirable quality except the willingness to marry. Few understood why. The war had taught Julian that appearances often concealed dangerous truths. Since returning home, he found the rituals of polite society exhausting. At every gathering, ambitious mothers displayed daughters as though arranging jewels in a merchant's window. Compliments sounded rehearsed. Smiles were carefully measured. Every conversation seemed to circle inevitably toward fortune, influence, or title. He had grown weary of being desired for a name rather than understood as a man. Only one person spoke to him without calculation. His steward, Mr. Collins. As Julian stepped from the unmarked carriage before Blackthorn Manor that snowy evening, Collins hurried down the front steps. You travelled without an escort again, my lord. It allows me to hear honest conversations. And did you? Julian removed his gloves slowly. I learned that my tenants worry more about winter fodder than tomorrow's banquet. They usually do. The steward hesitated before adding, there is another matter requiring your attention. Julian raised an eyebrow. A young lady has been waiting outside the gate since dawn. A guest? No, my lord. A petitioner. We believe so. Why has no one invited her inside? Collins looked uncomfortable. She is a Hawthorne. The name settled heavily between them. For nearly 30 years Ashcombe and Hawthorne had exchanged lawsuits, accusations, and bitter silence. Neither estate crossed the other's lands. Invitations were never sent. Friendships quietly ended if they favored both families. Julian had inherited the feud along with his title. He had never inherited the hatred. What is her condition? He asked quietly. Cold. Has she eaten? I do not know. Julian's expression hardened, not with anger toward the Hawthorns, but toward his own household. A woman has stood in the snow outside my gates for an entire day, and no one thought to offer her food. My lord. She is your enemy's sister. Julian looked toward the distant iron gates, barely visible through the falling snow. A solitary figure remained there, almost swallowed by the white evening. His voice was calm, yet carried the quiet authority that made servants obey without question. I asked about her condition. Collins lowered his eyes. She looks exhausted. Without another word, Julian turned from the brightly lit entrance of his manor and began walking alone through the snow toward the waiting woman. Behind him, guests continued laughing inside the great hall, completely unaware that their host had ignored his own celebration. Ahead, the lonely figure beyond the gates lifted her head as footsteps approached through the drifting snow. For the first time in 30 years, an Ashcombe willingly crossed the distance toward a Hawthorne. The snow softened every sound. Julian Ashcombe walked without haste, his polished boots sinking into the fresh white layer covering the gravel drive. He ignored the curious glances from servants peering through the manor windows. Behind him, music drifted faintly from the ballroom, cheerful and warm, belonging to another world entirely. The woman beyond the gates watched him approach. She straightened instinctively, though fatigue weighed heavily upon her shoulders. Her hands remained folded before her, fingers reddened by hours in the bitter cold. When Julian stopped a few feet away, neither spoke at once. He noticed the details first. The hem of her cloak was soaked from melting snow. One glove had been carefully mended several times. A loose strand of chestnut hair clung to her cheek, carried there by the winter wind. Yet despite the hardship written across her appearance, she stood with remarkable dignity. Not proud, simply unwilling to surrender it. You have waited a very long time, Julian said at last. His voice was calm, carrying neither accusation nor sympathy. Only quiet observation. Eleanor lowered her eyes respectfully. I have, my lord. Why? She hesitated. I feared if I left, I would lose the courage to return. Julian studied her face. Most people seeking favors hurried into explanations. They spoke too quickly, offered excuses before questions. This young woman answered only what had been asked. He found it unexpectedly refreshing. The gates were never opened, he said. No, you were offered nothing. She glanced briefly toward the manor. No one wished to offend you. A faint crease appeared between Julian's brows. By showing common courtesy. She remained silent. Silence, he realized, was not avoidance. It was restraint. She had no desire to embarrass those who had ignored her. That alone told him something about her character. The wind swept across the grounds once more. Without thinking, Julian removed the heavy wool cloak from his shoulders. My lord, Eleanor protested softly as he placed it around her. You'll be cold. I've been walking. You are still without a coat. And you have been without one since morning. His answer left no room for argument. The thick fabric settled warmly around her shoulders, carrying the faint scent of cedar and winter air. For the first time that day, Eleanor felt warmth. Not merely from the cloak, from the unexpected kindness. She looked at him properly then. He was taller than she had imagined, his dark overcoat dusted with snow, his expression composed rather than stern. The lines near his eyes suggested responsibility more than age. This did not resemble the cruel enemy described throughout her childhood. You expected someone else, Julian observed. She smiled faintly. I expected an angry Earl. And instead, I am no longer certain. A hint of amusement touched his expression before disappearing almost as quickly as it came. You know who I am. I recognize you from your father's portrait. And yet you still came. I had nowhere else to go. The honesty of the answer lingered between them. No manipulation. No rehearsed speech. Simply truth. Julian opened the iron gate himself. The heavy hinges groaned into the winter evening. Servants watching from distant windows exchanged bewildered glances. Their master had not only spoken with Hawthorne, he had opened Blackthorn Manor's gates with his own hands. Julian stepped aside. Miss Hawthorne. She looked at him uncertainly. I cannot promise to solve whatever has brought you here. Hope flickered cautiously within her eyes. But no guest, or even an enemy, should stand outside my home in the snow. He inclined his head toward the warmly lit manor. Please come inside. For a brief moment Eleanor could not move. Crossing that threshold meant entering the house her family had spent decades despising. It also meant placing her future entirely in the hands of the one man she had been taught never to trust. Taking a slow breath, she stepped across the gates. Neither of them noticed the figure watching silently from an upstairs window, the Dowager Countess, whose expression revealed that she already sensed this unexpected visitor might change the future of Blackthorn Manor forever. Warm air greeted Eleanor the moment the great doors of Blackthorn Manor closed behind her. The scent of burning oak, polished cedar, and fresh bread replaced the bitter sting of snow. For an instant she simply stood there, uncertain whether she belonged beneath such a magnificent roof. A housemaid hurried forward with towels, but stopped halfway, glancing nervously toward the steward. Shall I? Before Mr. Collins could answer, Julian spoke. Miss Hawthorne is my guest. The hesitation vanished. Yes, my lord. Within moments another servant brought a steaming cup of tea while a maid carefully brushed melting snow from Eleanor's cloak. No one questioned the Earl aloud, though curious eyes followed every movement. The Dowager Countess descended the grand staircase with measured elegance. Though well into her 70s, Lady Beatrice Ashcombe carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. So, she said, studying Eleanor with sharp blue eyes, this is the young lady who has caused every servant in my house to abandon their duties and stare through the windows. Eleanor lowered into a graceful curtsy. I apologize if my presence has inconvenienced your household, my lady. The older woman watched her for several silent moments. No excuses. No trembling. No attempts to flatter. Interesting. Julian spoke calmly. Grandmother, Miss Hawthorne has travelled a long distance. So I can see. Lady Beatrice turned toward the nearest maid. Prepare the blue guest room. Mr. Collins blinked in surprise. My lady. The blue room. It is warm, comfortable, and unoccupied. She looked back at Eleanor. If my grandson has invited you inside, you shall be treated properly. Relief softened Eleanor's expression. Thank you. Lady Beatrice merely nodded, though inwardly she found herself unexpectedly pleased. Courtesy revealed more about breeding than expensive gowns ever could. A few minutes later, dinner was announced. Julian ignored the startled expressions around the dining room. Miss Hawthorne, he said, pulling out a chair beside his own. Please. Several neighbouring ladies exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered behind her fan. The Earl seats his enemy's sister beside him. Another quietly replied, perhaps she will not remain long. Eleanor heard them. She pretended not to. Julian noticed. Without acknowledging the whispers, he calmly served vegetables onto her plate before serving himself. It was such a simple gesture that most guests overlooked it. Eleanor did not. Nor did Lady Beatrice. Conversation soon drifted toward estate matters. A neighbouring baron complained loudly about dismissing several aging servants. They're simply too slow now, he declared. Sentiment has no place in running an efficient household. Julian laid down his fork. My oldest gardener has served Ashcombe Manor for 42 years. The baron shrugged. Then surely he's overdue for retirement. He requested retirement. And I increased his wages and asked him to train the younger gardeners instead. The table fell quiet. Julian continued evenly. Experience is not a burden. It is an inheritance. Across the table, Eleanor looked at him with quiet admiration. Not because he was wealthy. Because he remembered the value of ordinary people. Julian caught the expression only briefly. It wasn't admiration for his title. It was respect for his character. He found that strangely comforting. As dinner ended, Lady Beatrice approached her grandson privately. You have scarcely looked at any lady tonight. Julian smiled faintly. I've been occupied. So I noticed. The Countess glanced toward Eleanor, who was quietly thanking servants for the meal. Most young ladies spend an evening trying to be noticed. And Miss Hawthorne? Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. She spends it trying not to inconvenience anyone. Julian followed his grandmother's gaze. For reasons he could not yet explain, he found that far more difficult to ignore. Yet neither of them knew that before dawn, a rider from London would arrive carrying news that threatened to destroy the fragile peace beginning to form beneath Blackthorn Manor's roof. The manor lay in silence long before dawn. Snow continued to fall beyond the tall windows, blanketing the gardens and winding lanes until Blackthorn Manor seemed cut off from the rest of the world. Only the occasional crackle from the fireplaces disturbed the stillness. Eleanor awoke before sunrise. She had slept little. The warmth of the guest chamber felt almost undeserved after the previous day's hardships. Looking out of the window, she saw servants already clearing snow from the courtyard. Not wishing to burden anyone, she dressed quietly and slipped downstairs. In the kitchens, the household had only just begun its morning routine. Mrs. Dalton, the elderly cook, looked up in surprise. Miss Hawthorne, you should have rung the bell. I didn't wish to trouble anyone. The cook smiled kindly. Then perhaps you might keep me company while the bread finishes baking. Eleanor gladly accepted. She rolled pastry, arranged fresh herbs, and listened more than she spoke. When a young kitchen maid accidentally dropped a basket of eggs and burst into tears, fearing dismissal, Eleanor knelt beside her without hesitation. It was an accident, she said gently. Let us save the unbroken ones together. The frightened girl looked at her with gratitude. Unknown to Eleanor, someone had been watching from the doorway. Julian. He had come to the kitchens only for his morning coffee, but instead he paused unnoticed. She did not realize he was there. Her kindness was not performed for admiration. It was simply who she was. He remembered the polished smiles of countless ladies in London who had praised charity in grand speeches while leaving servants invisible. Eleanor spoke to each member of the staff by looking them in the eye. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Without entering the room, Julian quietly turned away. Later that morning, he found Lady Beatrice reading beside the library fire. "You've noticed her," the Countess remarked without looking up from her book. Julian poured himself tea. "I've noticed that everyone in this house seems more comfortable after speaking with her." Lady Beatrice smiled knowingly. "That is a rare gift." Before Julian could answer, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. Mr. Collins entered carrying a leather satchel sealed with wax. "My lord, a courier has arrived from London." Julian broke the seal. His expression gradually lost its calm. "What has happened?" Lady Beatrice asked. "It concerns Edmund Hawthorne." Eleanor, who had just entered the library with a tray of fresh tea, stopped in the doorway. Julian looked toward her. "The charges against your brother have become more serious." Her hands tightened around the tray. What charges?" "The creditors now accuse him of fraud." The tray trembled slightly before Julian stepped forward and carefully took it from her hands. "My brother would never steal," Eleanor whispered. "The letter claims documents were signed in his name." She shook her head immediately. "No. You are certain?" "Completely." Julian studied her face. There was fear, shock, but not the slightest hint of doubt. She believed her brother's innocence with absolute conviction. After a long silence, Julian folded the letter. "I will travel to London tomorrow." Everyone looked at him in surprise. Lady Beatrice spoke first. "This matter does not concern Ashcombe." Julian met his grandmother's gaze. "It concerns justice." "And if the Hawthorns have deceived you?" "Then I shall discover the truth." He turned toward Eleanor. "I cannot promise your brother is innocent." "I understand. But neither will I condemn a man without examining the facts." For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Manor, tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes. Not because her troubles had ended. Because someone had finally chosen fairness over prejudice. Yet as the snowstorm strengthened outside, another rider was already racing toward the manor, carrying evidence that suggested the feud between the Ashcombes and Hawthorns had been built upon a lie far greater than either family had ever imagined. The following morning, Blackthorn Manor was unusually quiet. The previous evening's celebration had ended, and most guests had already departed beneath a pale winter sky. Fresh snow covered the carriage tracks almost as quickly as they were made, leaving the estate wrapped once again in silence. Julian intended to leave for London before noon. His horse had been saddled. The carriage was prepared. Yet before he could depart, another visitor arrived unexpectedly. A black coach bearing the Hawthorn crest rolled through the gates. Eleanor's heart sank. Only one person would travel under that crest with such confidence. Her brother's cousin, Nathaniel Hawthorne. He stepped from the carriage dressed in expensive clothes that contrasted sharply with the family's supposed financial ruin. His polished smile disappeared the moment he saw Eleanor standing beside Julian on the front steps. "There you are," Nathaniel said coldly. "You've embarrassed the family long enough." Eleanor remained calm. "I came to seek help." "You came begging." "I came seeking justice." Nathaniel laughed bitterly. "From an Ashcombe." Julian descended the final step. "Mr. Hawthorne." Nathaniel offered only the slightest bow. "My lord." "You've traveled a considerable distance." "I've come to bring my cousin home." Julian folded his hands behind his back. "Miss Hawthorne is free to make that decision herself." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Our family's affairs are not yours." "Not yet," Julian replied evenly. "But they may become mine if false accusations have been made." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Nathaniel's face. "You intend to involve yourself?" "I intend to uncover the truth." Nathaniel turned sharply toward Eleanor. "Have you told him everything?" "I've hidden nothing." "Nothing?" His voice rose. "Did you tell him father lost half the estate because of the Ashcombes?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I told him what I know." "What you know is very little." Lady Beatrice, watching from the doorway, quietly observed the exchange. Nathaniel seemed eager to inflame old wounds rather than resolve them. Julian noticed it too. Before another word could be spoken, Mr. Collins hurried across the courtyard carrying a second letter. "My lord, this arrived only moments ago." Julian broke the seal. His expression grew increasingly grave. "What is it?" Eleanor asked softly. "The magistrate has postponed Edmund Hawthorne's hearing." Relief briefly crossed her face. "But—" Julian looked toward her. "A witness has appeared claiming your brother accepted money to forge estate documents." Eleanor shook her head instantly. "No." Nathaniel spoke before she could continue. "Then perhaps Edmund lied to all of us." She turned toward him in disbelief. "You cannot truly believe that." "I believe desperate men do desperate things." Julian watched them carefully. Eleanor defended her brother despite everything he had done. Nathaniel condemned him with surprising ease. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. That afternoon, Julian finally departed for London. As his carriage disappeared down the snow-covered road, Eleanor stood silently on the manor steps, watching until it vanished beyond the trees. Lady Beatrice approached beside her. "You trust him?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "I barely know him." "That wasn't my question." After a long pause, Eleanor answered honestly. "I trust that he wants the truth." The Countess looked thoughtfully toward the distant road. "So do I." Neither woman noticed Nathaniel standing at an upstairs window. His pleasant expression had completely disappeared. Hidden inside his coat pocket rested a folded document bearing the Hawthorne family seal, a document he prayed Julian Ashcombe would never discover. London wore winter differently than the countryside. Its streets were crowded instead of quiet, its air thick with smoke instead of pine, and its people hurried past one another with little interest in anyone else's troubles. Yet beneath the noise, justice was still decided by men whose signatures could ruin, or redeem, a family's future. Julian Ashcombe arrived at the magistrate's office before noon. The clerk recognized him immediately. "My lord, we were not expecting you." "I've come regarding Edmund Hawthorne." The clerk exchanged an uneasy glance with another official before leading Julian into a private chamber. There is an unusual complication. Julian took the bundle of documents placed before him. Contracts, debt records, witness statements. At first glance they appeared convincing, but years of managing one of England's largest estates had taught Julian to notice small inconsistencies. One signature caught his attention. Another followed. The handwriting varied slightly from page to page. The ink on two supposedly older documents appeared fresher than the others. Someone had assembled evidence too carefully, as though trying to make it believable. Who submitted these? Julian asked. A relative of Mr. Hawthorne. What relative? The clerk consulted his ledger. Nathaniel Hawthorne. Julian's eyes narrowed. Has he testified? This morning. And where is he now? He departed shortly afterward. Julian requested permission to interview Edmund. The magistrate agreed. Inside the cold stone holding room, Edmund Hawthorne looked nothing like the proud man Eleanor had described. His clothes were wrinkled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. Exhaustion had replaced arrogance. When the guard unlocked the door, Edmund looked up in surprise. The Earl of Ashcombe. Julian stepped inside. I'm not here because of our family names. Then why? Your sister asked me to find the truth. At the mention of Eleanor, Edmund lowered his head. I failed her. Did you forge those documents? No. Did you accept illegal payments? Never. Julian watched him carefully. Fear could be acted. Regret rarely could. Then who benefited from your downfall? Edmund answered almost immediately. Nathaniel. Julian remained silent. My cousin managed many of father's accounts after his illness began, Edmund continued. He insisted I signed documents without reading every page. I trusted him. You have proof. Edmund closed his eyes. No, but if anyone destroyed our family, it was him. Hours later, Julian left the courthouse carrying copies of every disputed document. Back at Blackthorn Manor, Eleanor waited anxiously in the library. Every passing carriage made her heart race. As evening settled, hoofbeats finally echoed across the courtyard. Julian entered with snow upon his shoulders. One look at his face told Eleanor everything had changed. Please, she whispered, tell me. Julian placed the documents upon the table. Your brother has been deceived. Tears immediately filled her eyes. I knew it. But proving it will not be easy. Lady Beatrice entered quietly. What have you found? Julian unfolded one final paper. The handwriting belongs to Nathaniel. Silence filled the room. He forged the contracts. He manipulated the debts. He allowed Edmund to take the blame. And, Julian added gravely, I believe he deliberately kept the feud alive because it prevented either family from comparing their records. Eleanor stared at the evidence in disbelief. Nearly 30 years of hatred. Countless broken relationships. Ruined lives. All sustained by the greed of one man. Julian looked steadily at her. Tomorrow morning, Nathaniel will face the magistrate. And if he confesses, the Hawthorne name will be cleared. Outside, the church bells rang across the snow-covered countryside as a new day approached. For the first time in decades, the truth stood only one confession away, and with it came a choice that would forever change both the Ashcombe and Hawthorne families. Morning sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting a pale golden glow across Blackthorn Manor. The snow sparkled beneath the light, as though nature itself had decided the long winter should finally begin to soften. Inside the county magistrate's chamber, the room was filled with uneasy silence. Nathaniel Hawthorne stood confidently before the bench, convinced his carefully woven lies would survive one more day. Several local landowners had gathered to witness the hearing, among them Lady Beatrice Ashcombe and Eleanor, who remained quietly seated near the back of the chamber. Julian stood beside the magistrate's desk. He carried no dramatic speech, only a leather folder filled with evidence. The magistrate adjusted his spectacles. Lord Ashcombe, you requested this hearing be reopened. Have you discovered new information? I have. Julian calmly placed the forged contracts upon the desk. These signatures were claimed to belong to Edmund Hawthorne. The magistrate nodded. They were. No. Julian opened another document. They were copied. A handwriting specialist from London stepped forward and carefully explained the differences between the authentic signatures and the forged ones. Every inconsistency was demonstrated with quiet precision. Nathaniel's confidence began to fade. Julian produced a second ledger. This estate account records payments transferred into a private account. The magistrate frowned. Whose account? Julian looked directly at Nathaniel. His. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Nathaniel immediately protested. Those records are false. Julian remained composed. Then perhaps you can explain why the account bears your personal seal. Nathaniel opened his mouth but found no answer. The magistrate ordered another document to be presented. It was the final piece. A letter recovered from Nathaniel's solicitor, written months earlier, instructing him to delay legal proceedings until the Hawthorne estate could be sold below its true value. The room fell completely silent. Nathaniel's shoulders slumped. He realized there was nowhere left to hide. He whispered. I never intended anyone to be imprisoned. The magistrate's voice became stern. But you intended to profit. Nathaniel lowered his head. Yes. A single confession erased nearly 30 years of suspicion. The charges against Edmund Hawthorne were dismissed immediately. By afternoon, Edmund walked free. The first person he searched for was Eleanor. When he saw her waiting outside the courthouse, he stopped several steps away, overcome with shame. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I spent years teaching you to hate people who had done you no wrong. Eleanor embraced him before he could say another word. You came back. Because of you. He looked toward Julian. And because of him. Edmund approached the Earl and extended his hand. I cannot repay what you've done. Julian accepted the handshake. You owe me nothing. I owe you my family's future. Julian smiled faintly. Then honor it by ending this feud. I will. Weeks later, Blackthorn Manor welcomed guests once more. This time, however, Hawthorns and Ashcombes entered through the same front doors. No whispered insults. No suspicious glances. only cautious conversations that gradually became genuine laughter. Lady Beatrice watched from across the drawing room with quiet satisfaction. She noticed something else as well. Julian's eyes found Eleanor almost without thinking. And whenever Eleanor looked toward him, she smiled, not out of obligation, but because she had found peace in his presence. The bitterness that had divided two families for decades had finally come to an end. Only one question remained unanswered. Would the friendship quietly growing between the Earl and Eleanor become something far greater? Peacespring arrived quietly at Blackthorn Manor. The harsh winds of winter gave way to gentle mornings scented with blossoming hawthorn and fresh rain. The gardens, once buried beneath snow, burst into color, while birdsong replaced the silence that had lingered over the estate for so many months. For the first time in years, Ashcombe and Hawthorn tenants worked side by side repairing stone walls that had long divided their lands. Children crossed fields that parents had forbidden them to enter. Old servants exchanged stories instead of suspicious glances. The feud had not merely ended. It had begun to fade into history. Edmund Hawthorn remained true to his promise. After reclaiming his family's estate, he dismissed dishonest agents, settled every lawful debt, and personally apologized to those who had suffered because of his pride. One afternoon he stood beside Julian overlooking the valley between their neighboring lands. I spent years believing our greatest enemy lived across those fields, Edmund admitted. Julian folded his arms. And where did you finally find him? Edmund gave a weary smile. Within my own family. The Earl nodded thoughtfully. Hatred often blinds us to the dangers closest to home. The two men shared a quiet understanding that neither could have imagined only months before. Inside the manor, Lady Beatrice watched Eleanor arranging fresh flowers in the drawing room. You've made this old house brighter, the Countess observed. Eleanor smiled modestly. The flowers deserve the credit. No. Lady Beatrice gently adjusted a single white rose. They bloom because someone cared enough to tend them. Eleanor understood the deeper meaning but simply lowered her eyes with a grateful smile. A few evenings later, Julian invited Eleanor to walk through the gardens. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and soft gold as they followed a winding path beside the lake. Neither hurried to fill the silence. It had become one of the things they treasured most about each other. At the small stone bridge where wildflowers now grew between the cracks, Julian finally stopped. I have spent much of my life believing duty must always come before happiness. Eleanor looked at him quietly. And now? Now I believe the greatest duty is recognizing happiness when Providence places it before us. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I cannot promise a life without difficulties. He opened it, revealing a simple yet elegant sapphire ring that had belonged to his mother. I cannot promise every season will be as gentle as this one. His voice remained calm, though emotion softened every word. But I can promise honesty, respect, and a home where your kindness will always be treasured. He met her eyes. Eleanor Hawthorn, would you honor me by becoming the Countess of Ashcombe? For a moment, the world seemed wonderfully still. She remembered the freezing morning outside the manor gates, the closed iron bars, the loneliness, the unexpected kindness of a man who had opened those gates himself. She smiled through tears of quiet happiness. Yes. Julian slipped the ring onto her finger. Not because two powerful families needed an alliance. Not because society expected it. But because, somewhere between forgiveness and truth, two guarded hearts had discovered a love neither had been searching for. Months later, the wedding bells echoed across the countryside. Ashcombes and Hawthorns sat together beneath the same roof, celebrating not the union of two estates, but the healing of two families. As Eleanor stepped into her new home, she paused briefly before the manor gates. Julian noticed. What are you thinking? She smiled warmly. The first time I stood here, I believed every door had closed. And now? She looked at the open gates stretching toward the road beyond. Now I know that sometimes the door that changes your life is the one opened by kindness. Hand in hand, they walked toward Blackthorn Manor as the evening sun bathed the estate in golden light. And long after those who had started the old feud were forgotten, people still remembered the story of the Earl who chose compassion over hatred, and the quiet young woman whose gentle heart proved strong enough to heal what pride never could.